Welcome. Good evening, everyone. I almost said good morning. I'm so used to doing these things early in the morning. Good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event today. My name is Andrea Gammon. I'm the Director of Education here at the festival, and I'm so delighted that you're here for this special forum event with us this evening. It gives me great delight and not a little trepidation to introduce to you our distinguished guest today, Stanley Wells, the Stanley Wells. To say that Stanley Wells is a Shakespeare scholar is deeply reductionist and woefully inadequate. He is preeminent in the world of Shakespeare studies, and his knowledge and influence has shaped the face of Shakespearean scholarship for nearly the last half-century. It is well nigh impossible to do justice in a short introduction to this incredible personage and his contribution to the field. But to start with, a few facts. Professor Wells is the honorary president, a life trustee, and former chairman of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon. He is Emeritus Professor of Shakespeare Studies at the University of Birmingham, where he was Professor of Shakespeare Studies and the Director of the Shakespeare Institute from 1988 to 1997. He is Honorary Emeritus Governor of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre and a member of the Board of Directors of the Globe Theatre. He holds a PhD from the University of Birmingham and honorary doctorates from no less than 5 universities: Furman University in South Carolina and the universities of Munich, Hull, Durham, and Warwick. Amidst numerous accolades and notable awards throughout his distinguished career, in 2007 he was awarded a CBE and made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire. As you can imagine, over the course of his lifetime with Shakespeare, Professor Wells has amassed a very large and impressive body of work. A prolific, diligent, and indefatigable scholar, Professor Wells has essentially written or edited a book a year for the past 40 years. And he shows no signs of slowing down. There is no way I can possibly do justice to them all, so I'll just mention a few highlights. His co-editorial works include the landmark Oxford Complete Works of Shakespeare, Shakespeare and Race and Shakespeare and Sexuality for the Cambridge University Press, the Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare, the Oxford Companion to Shakespeare, the Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare on the Stage, and most recently, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Evidence, Argument, and Controversy. He has edited several titles for Penguin Shakespeare and Oxford Shakespeare series, and has spent nearly 20 years as the editor of the annual Shakespeare Survey. He is the author of numerous seminal works. His most recent books include Shakespeare for All Time, which notably has been hailed as the best book on Shakespeare for a generation, Looking for Sex in Shakespeare, Shakespeare and Company, Is It True What They Say About Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, Sex, and Love. But Stanley Wells is far more than just the sum of these parts. His style, granted deeply researched, scholarly, and sound, is also warmly accessible, and indeed his engagement with Shakespeare over more than 4 decades has not only contributed greatly to the most serious scholarship, but has always sought to appeal to the general reader as well. His topic for us today is sex and love in Venice, Verona, and Vienna. What could be more generally appealing than that? His influence in the field of Shakespeare studies and on our general understanding, knowledge, and perception of Shakespeare and his works cannot be overestimated, and long may he continue to spearhead the perennial renewing of Shakespeare's appeal today and in the future. It is truly an honor to have him here with us today and part of this inaugural year of the forum. So please help me give a warm welcome to the inimitable, incomparable Professor Stanley Wells.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a good job I couldn't hear all those wonderful things that Andrea was saying about me. Might have made me conceited. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be back here in Stratford. I was last here in 1975 when I saw four plays. I'd been lecturing at the University of Waterloo, and it's wonderful to be back. Well, I want to start by reading to you 2 of Shakespeare's sonnets, often regarded as the greatest love poems in English. First, Sonnet 29. When, in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. It's a poem of idealized love, the speaker rejoicing in the spiritual rapture that memory of his beloved brings even in his darkest moments. I say his because even if we didn't assume that Shakespeare was writing in his own person, we should know from phrases like desiring this man's art and that man's scope that it comes from a man. He could be addressing another male, young or not, as he clearly is when the poem is heard, for example, in the setting by Rufus Wainwright. Or he might be addressing a woman. It's a love poem in the broadest sense. If we think of Shakespeare's plays, we might, I think, imagine it as being spoken in his darkest moments by, for example, Claudio of Measure for Measure, to Juliet, or by Bassanio of The Merchant of Venice, to his loving friend Antonio. It's not explicitly a poem of sexual love, but it certainly doesn't deny the possibility that the relationship is sexual. Now a very different poem, Sonnet 129. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action. And till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated, as a swallowed bait on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit and in possession so, having, and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. That poem, with its puns on spirit in the sense of seamen and of waste, in the senses of both the bodily part and wasteland, hell as vagina, along with its concern with lust in action, is unequivocally sexual. It's gendered by the word men in the last line. It's a tortured meditation, a poem of self-investigation, like a soliloquy from a play. It's a poem of a man with a conscience, a declaration of bitter self-contempt in which the speaker castigates himself for having yielded to the demands of loveless sexual compulsion. It could come from a rapist, like Tarquin in Shakespeare's poem The Rape of Lucrece, or from somebody contemplating rape, like Angelo in Measure for Measure. Taken together, I think these two poems represent opposite extremes of the spectrum of love and desire that Shakespeare explores and exploits for dramatic purposes in his plays as well as in his poems. Whether Shakespeare's sonnets are autobiographical utterances in which he's giving us direct access to his own thoughts and feelings is a question which has been endlessly debated and which ultimately is unanswerable. But it's unquestionable that he thought long and hard about the issues that he raises in these poems, and that he projects an equally wide range of attitudes to both love and sex through the situations and the characters of his plays. Let's think about this in relation particularly to the plays that we're seeing this week. The Merchant of Venice belongs to the group of plays, all written during the first part of his career, which we often call romantic comedies. They're romantic in the sense that they treat of an idealized kind of love, which places the beloved on a pedestal, in which the lover feels an idealized, spiritualized kind of rapture, experiencing a relationship that is unique to this particular pair of human beings. The lover placing a valuation on a beloved which is far greater than that experienced by anybody else, indulging in a kind of worship that lies beyond reason and which indeed may even seem ridiculous to impartial onlookers. Early in the scene in The Merchant of Venice, in which Bassanio comes to make his choice among the 3 caskets that will decide his fate as Portia's suitor, Portia, makes it entirely clear that he is the suitor she hopes will make the right choice. Beshrew your eyes, they have o'erlooked me and divided me. One half of me is yours, the other half yours. Mine own, I would say, but if mine, then yours, and so all yours. She admits that in her anxiety to make the right choice, she's just delaying the moment of decision. I speak too long. 'Tis but to pease the time, to eke it, and to draw it out in length, to stay you from election. At least she does if the actress gets her words right. Judi Dench has written about a production in the other Stratford in which she says Michael Williams, who was her husband in real life, was standing in the center of the stage as Bassanio, about to make his choice. There was a wind band at the back of the stage, Peter Geddes as Gobbo, Polly James waiting to sing Tell Me Where Is Fancy Bred, and my brother Jeff and Bernard Lloyd as monks. I was supposed to say, I speak too long, 'tis but to piece the time, to eke it, and to draw it out in length, to stay you from election, but I said erection. The band just put down their instruments and walked off, unable to control their laughter, as did the monks, leaving Polly James to sing on her own. Well, there the atmosphere of romance was abruptly shattered by the substitution of a word with sexual connotations for an innocent one. Judi Dench is a terrible tease. She once tucked away into the leaden casket a fairy cake. Reward for the right choice. The story of Bassanio and Portia is a story of courtship and wooing, reaching its happy and natural consummation in marriage. It's a story, that is to say, in which romantic, idealized love leads to a sexual union which has the blessing of church and state and society. There are other such relationships in the play, most notably those of Shylock's daughter Jessica, who elopes with Lorenzo, and Bassanio's friend Graziano with Portia's maid Nerissa. It's characteristic of the conventions of romantic comedy, as well as a natural result of dramatic economy, that the latter storyline, involving characters on a rather lower social scale than those of the main plot, should be handled in a less romantic, more broadly comic style than that of Bassanio and Portia, typified by the bawdy pun with which Graziano brings the play to an end with a promise to keep safe Nerissa's ring. But the most dramatically intense love relationship in The Merchant of Venice, of course, is the one between 2 men, Antonio, the Merchant of Venice, and his friend Bassanio. At the start, Antonio is overcome with melancholy. In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. His state of mind is rather like that of the speaker of the first of the sonnets that I quoted. He feels himself to be in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. When Salanio says he must be in love, he replies enigmatically, "Fie, fie." Nobody knows what he means. Nothing in the play suggests that he has any romantic or sexual interest in women, and at the end of the play, he's very much the odd man out, with the two pairs of lovers, whether or not the director chooses to include him in the happiness of the ending. Whole articles have been written about Antonio at the end of The Merchant of Venice. Both Antonio and Bassanio speak about their love for each other, but they do so in the context of Antonio's promise to raise as much money as he can to help Bassanio in his wooing of Portia. He behaves with extraordinary self-sacrificing generosity to this end, putting his life at risk by wagering a pound of his own flesh. In other words, by offering to die for Bassanio. Onlookers speak of the depth of love between the two men. Salanio describes how, when they parted, Antonio, his eye being big with tears, turning his face, he put his hand behind him, and, with affection wondrous sensible, he wrung Bassanio's hand. To which Salanio responds with, "I think he only loves the world for him." When Antonio thinks he's about to die at Shylock's hands, he again expresses love for his friend. "Say how I loved you, speak me fair in death, and when the tale is told, bid her be judge whether Bassanio had not once a love." And Bassanio responds with a passionate avowal of love for his friend. "Life itself, my wife and all the world, are not with me esteemed above thy life." We are given no reason to doubt Bassanio's heterosexual love for Portia, but that's not incompatible with the suggestion that, as some directors and actors have suggested, with fond looks, embraces, and kisses, that Antonio loves Bassanio sexually, whether or not the feeling is reciprocated, just as it's not unreasonable to read Sonnet 29 as a declaration of sexual love between two males. A love which, at least until very recently, could have the blessing of neither society nor church. It was interesting to me to see that this relationship was not directly suggested in the current production, that there was a degree of what we call homosocial relationship among the young men, I thought, they're having been coming on, just having played tennis. When we think of Shakespeare in romantic love, the first play that comes to mind is likely to be Romeo and Juliet. This best known of all love stories, although it comes to a tragic conclusion, almost seems set to be a romantic comedy until the dramatic turn of events resulting in the death of Romeo's close friend Mercutio. As the poet in Sonnet 29 speaks about the lark at break of day arising, so Romeo, preparing to part from Juliet after their one night of love, describes the lark as the herald of the morn. This play has a sonnet as its prologue. The lovers first address each other in speeches which, taken together, form a sonnet. Of all Shakespeare's plays, it's the one that's most closely indebted to the sonnet tradition, with its idealizations of the beloved and its awareness of the enclosed world of rapture that love can create. But just as in the second sonnet I read, in Sonnet 129, just as Shakespeare uses sonnet form to explore the darker shores of love, the sexual madness to which love is close allied, so Romeo and Juliet creates elaborate patterns out of the relationship between sex and love. In the opening bawdy dialogue among Capulet's servants, with their jokes about maidenheads, pretty pieces of flesh, and standing to it, we see sex without love. On a higher intellectual level, Mercutio, too, embodies this attitude. Neither Mercutio nor Juliet's nurse can enter imaginatively into the hero and heroine's romantic states of mind. And then when Romeo first appears, moonsick, For love of the absent Rosaline, we see unembodied romance, love without sex. And when Juliet first comes on the scene, she is juvenilely virginal, less than 14 years old. It's very unusual for Shakespeare to be quite so explicit about the age of a character. But then when she and Romeo meet, true love blossoms, love which is fully romantic, but which is also impelled by physical desire. When Juliet looks forward to her wedding night, in the speech beginning, "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds," she does so in full expectation of the enjoyment of sexual pleasure. And Shakespeare makes her emphasize that in coming together, both she and Romeo will lose their virginity. The match is played, she says, for a pair of stainless maidenhoods. The consummation will be fully sexual, but true love acted, put into action, will retain its romance. And hallowed by the sacrament of marriage, it will be simple modesty. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare was working out and projecting a view of the transfiguring effect that love can have on sex. Or to put it the other way around, on the way that sex can come as the transfiguring climax to a love relationship. It's clear from all Shakespeare's writings that he had a deep understanding of sexual desire, of the fun, the sensual pleasure, the sense of spiritual transfiguration that sex can bring. When I was writing my book called Shakespeare, Sex and Love, I came strongly to feel that as Shakespeare developed in experience of both life and art, his attitudes to sexual experience gradually matured and darkened. In his earlier plays, he gets a lot of fun out of sexual wordplay, jokes, the comic situations into which sexual desire, allied to love, drives people. I think of comedies like The Taming of the Shrew, Love's Labour's Lost, Much Ado About Nothing, The Merry Wives of Windsor, As You Like It, all written in the first half of his career. But as Shakespeare got older, and presumably wiser, his treatment of sex and love, even in plays written in comic form, dwells less on the comic possibilities deriving from these impulses and more on the moral dilemmas that these impulses can create, as in the so-called problem plays. He dwells on sexual guilt, even nausea, in tragedies such as Hamlet and King Lear, and on the devastating effect of the withdrawal of love, as in Othello and Cymbeline. But at the same time, I think his view of love becomes more spiritualized, more mature, seeing it as a passion which has less of the romantic ardor of youth, but a deeper, more stable intensity. It's clear to me that he thought continuously and profoundly about the relationship between man's sexual and man's spiritual nature. He often seems to be asking, what's the difference between love and lust? He was acutely aware of the difficulty of understanding when and how the sexual faculty, which may be terribly abused in the search for sensual gratification and the wielding of power over other individuals, how this may nevertheless become a channel for the highest expression of human love. Like John Donne in his great poem, The Ecstasy, Shakespeare writes about love at times, both in his sonnets and his plays, especially I think in his later plays, in metaphysical, religious terms of soul and spirit, as a transcendental state of being, which reaches earthly fruition in sexual union, the richest kind of human communion, which, although it might seem like, to use Donne's word, a descent to earthliness from spirituality, yet is the nearest that weak man can attain to the communion of the gods. Love springs from the soul. In Sonnet 151, one of Shakespeare's most explicitly sexual poems, The poet says, "My soul doth tell my body that he may triumph in love." And when the mature lover Othello arrives in Cyprus, he greets his new wife, Desdemona, as "my soul's joy." And he decrees that "my soul hath her content so absolute that not another comfort like to this succeeds in unknown fate." Shakespeare opens Othello, a tragedy of true love, as he opens Romeo and Juliet, with images of lust. Even before we learn that Roderigo desires Desdemona, Iago is maligning the newly married Othello to his father-in-law Brabantio with grossly reductive images of bestial sexuality, characterizing Othello as an old black ram who is topping your white ewe, and as a Barbary horse who is covering the old man's daughter. Roderigo joins in, speaking of the gross clasps of a lascivious Moor. And when Brabantio first confronts Othello, it's with accusations that Othello is a practicer of arts inhibited, who has enchanted Desdemona, binding her in chains of magic, deluding her with foul charms, abusing her delicate youth with drugs or minerals that weakens emotion. He repeats these accusations to the Duke in the scene before the Senate when he precisely echoes the words that Shylock is reported to have spoken on hearing about Jessica's elopement. "My daughter, oh my daughter," both of them say. Othello directly rebuts, indeed he gently mocks such charges in his address to the Senate, scorning the very idea that he's used drugs, charms, conjurations, and mighty magic in his courtship. The first senator raises the tone with his suggestion that Othello's wooing may have been brought about by request, and such fair question as soul to soul affordeth. And the idea that Othello's and Desdemona's love is a true union of souls is established in the speeches that both of them make to the Senate. Unlike Romeo and Juliet, these are not young people encountering each other for the first time. Desdemona is young enough to be still under her father's care, but Othello is a mature man, apparently in his middle years. They are already, although only just, married to each other when we first see them, and they both make public declarations of the genuineness of their love in convincing enough terms to persuade the Duke of its reality. "This tale would win my daughter too," he says. Desdemona is confident, ironically confident in view of what is about to happen, that she can see Othello's visage in his mind. That their love is physical as well as spiritual is made explicit when Desdemona asks to be allowed to accompany Othello on his military journey. "If I be left behind, a moth of peace, and he go to the war, the rights for why I love him are bereft me." The word rights there, R-I-T-E-S, can also be thought of and heard as rights, R-I-G-H-T-S, the rights of war. Desdemona uses a word associated with religion to speak of her rights to sexual fulfillment. But in supporting her request, Othello is at pains to emphasize that he does so not simply out of physical desire. "I therefore begged not to please the palate of my appetite, nor to comply with heat, the young affects in me defunct, and proper satisfaction, but to be free and bounteous to her mind." And the Duke gives his blessing to the union in saying to Brabantio, "And, noble Signor, if virtue no delighted beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." The spirituality in Othello's love finds expression in a number of uses of the word soul. Arriving in Cyprus, he greets Desdemona with the words, "Oh, my soul's joy." He decrees, "My soul hath her content so absolute that not another comfort like to this succeeds in unknown fate." And Desdemona calls upon the heavens to increase their joys. In Romeo and Juliet, the reductive attitude towards sex, initiated by the servants in the opening scene and carried forward principally through the figures of Mercutio and the nurse, dwindles or is internalized after Mercutio's death. The young lovers transcend it and they die unsullied by it. But in Othello, this attitude is carried throughout the play in the figure of Iago. It results in the destruction of Othello's love and in his corruption. Iago's destructive cynicism consistently equates love with lust. He implicitly admits to villainy. And what's he then that says, I play the villain? How am I then a villain? And he even speaks about himself as a devil, drawing on the traditional imagery of devils as black, which is responsible for many of the paradoxes of this play, in which the black Othello initially belies the traditional connotations of his appearance. Devils were regularly painted as black in medieval dooms, paintings, for example. And he does so in lines which recall the traditions of late medieval morality plays, in which the devil would appear in the guise of a virtuous figure. He says, divinity of hell, when devils will the blackest sins put on, they do suggest at first with heavenly shows. They dress themselves up in a saintly fashion. Shakespeare causes Iago to accomplish his corruption of Othello in a single long scene, Act 3, Scene 3 of Othello, which is a virtuoso piece of dramatic craftsmanship, portraying a no less brilliant feat of psychological seduction. The first drop of poison to enter Othello's ear is Iago's simple words, "Ha, I like not that," as Cassio takes his leave of Desdemona and Emilia, stealing away guilty-like, according to Iago. Desdemona naively contributes to her own downfall in continuing to press Cassio's suit. But as she leaves, Othello expresses love for her, again using the word soul, in words of terrible irony. Excellent wretch, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee. And when I love thee not, chaos is come again. Othello, knowing for all his gullibility that appearances may deceive, demands ocular proof of Iago's insinuations, questioning the evidence of his own senses. By the world, I think my wife be honest, and think she is not. I think that thou art just, and think thou art not. Iago feeds his imagination with gross and bestial images of Desdemona in the sexual act with Cassio. Would you, the supervisor, grossly gape on, behold her topped? Were they as prime as goats, as hot as monkeys, as salt as wolves in pride? And then he launches into his fantasy about the sleeping Cassio making love to Iago in the belief that he's Desdemona. Othello reacts violently. I'll tear her all to pieces. Yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyrannous hate. O blood, blood, blood. And at the end of the scene, he and Iago kneel to enact that grotesque ritual in which Othello swears revenge and Iago dedicates himself to his master's service in a kind of mock marriage with the words, I am your own forever. The withdrawal from Othello of his sense of his own identity is symbolized in his language by the descent from the sublimely eloquent verse of farewell the tranquil mind, farewell content, farewell the plumed troops and the big wars that makes ambition virtue, to the incoherent prose of pish, nose, ears and lips, is possible, confess, handkerchief, oh devil, in which Cassio, not Iago, is the devil. And the descent is symbolized in his behavior by the literal descent from the upright posture of the dignified commander to the ignominious falling down in a trance in which Iago can exult over him. Perdition has caught his soul, and chaos is come again. In the last scene of the play, Othello sees himself as a man transformed to a beast, in a way that Cassio has earlier said that drunkenness can transform our souls into beasts. That parallel between the drunkenness of Cassio and Othello's lapse is a very deliberate one, I'm sure. It's why Cassio gets drunk. Does Othello in the closing episode remain a beast, or does he recover his manly stature? A.C. Bradley, the great critic writing in 1904, eloquently expressed the favorable point of view. Pity itself vanishes, and love and admiration alone remain in the majestic dignity and sovereign ascendancy of the close. Chaos has come and gone, and the Othello of the council chamber and the key of Cyprus has returned, or a greater and nobler Othello still. And this opinion can be supported by the horror that Othello expresses at what he has done even before he knows that Desdemona is innocent. O insupportable, O heavy hour, methinks it should be now a huge eclipse of sun and moon, and that the affrighted globe should yawn at alteration. The intensity of his remorse when he knows the truth is awesome in its vision of purgatorial suffering. Whip me, ye devils, from the possession of this heavenly sight. Blow me about in winds, roast me in sulphur, wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire. It resembles the condemned Claudio's terrible vision of death, of the torments of death, which we heard so eloquently spoken yesterday afternoon by Christopher Prentice, speaking the part of Claudio. And Othello's last big speech, in which he recovers something of the eloquence with which he had addressed the senators of Venice. Other critics, perhaps reacting against Bradley, though, have rejected the idea of an Othello whose suicide redeems him. T.S. Eliot, in an essay of 1927, famously remarked that he had never read a more terrible exposure of human weakness, of universal human weakness, than the last great speech of Othello. What Othello seems to be doing, he says, in making this speech is cheering himself up. The discrepancy of interpretation that the play permits reflects the difficulty of distinguishing between seeming and truth, which its characters too experience. In Measure for Measure, there's not much of the romantic attitude to love expressed in Sonnet 29. Even before we see Claudio and Julieta, their courtship, virtuous in itself, has resulted, because of what he describes as their most mutual entertainment, has resulted in her pregnancy and in his condemnation to death under the over-strict laws of Venice, or of Ferrara, where, as a result of recent research, there's now reason to believe that the play was originally set. The deputy ruler Angelo's desire for Claudio's sister is the perhaps over-virtuous novice Isabella. Angelo's desire for her derives, as he acknowledges, from a lust similar to that in which the speaker of Sonnet 129 deplores in himself, and indeed it implores Angelo too, appalls him. As he offers to save her brother's life, if she'll yield her virginity to him, he declares plainly, conceive, I love you. The choice of that sexually loaded word, conceive, where he might have said, for example, understand, is pointed. Love or lust? Are we not closer here to the anguish of Sonnet 129 than to the romance of Sonnet 29? If Isabella were to give way to Angelo at this point, wouldn't he, in effect, be raping her? As he pursues his suit, raw sexual desire appears to predominate over the tenderness of love, such as that of Romeo for Juliet or Lorenzo for Jessica. Isabella sees through him. She tries to capitalize on the situation by threatening to expose him as a would-be rapist unless he signs a pardon for her brother. But Angelo coldly asks, "Who would believe thee, Isabel?" and acknowledges his sinfulness as he declares that he will give his sensual race the rein unless she yields up her body to his will. And the play's conclusion is about as unromantic as the end of a comedy can be. Isabella says nothing in reply to two separate proposals of marriage from the Duke. Does she accept him? This was the traditional way of ending the play until a famous production by John Barton in 1970, also at the other Stratford, where, under the influence, no doubt, of feminist thought, she simply stood, looking puzzled in the center of the stage as the other characters departed. Or does she even silently reject him? It's all left to the director and actor. A prime example of the openness of Shakespeare's texts to free interpretation. And that is one of the reasons why we can go on seeing Shakespeare's plays again and again in productions which continue to reveal new facets of their rich openness to reinterpretation. Thank you. Thank you.
So, Professor Wells is open to and agreeable to fielding questions. So if anyone has a question for him, raise your hand and I'll make sure you get the microphone so that our live stream audience can hear if you have a question. Yes, sir.
Yes, Dr. Wells, noting that you've have a new book out on Shakespeare and the Shakespeare deniers, I wonder if you'd comment on the perpetuation of the Shakespeare deniers, despite scholars like yourself who, for most people's purposes, have settled the matter.
Well, it's not always easy for me to remain moderate in my comments about this sort of thing. I mean, well, my actual feeling is that human folly goes on in spite of every effort to rebut it.
Actually, in a few moments, we will actually get into that discussion a little bit more. We also happen to have here Dr. Paul Edmondson, who is a colleague of Stanley Wells and who co-edited Shakespeare Beyond Doubt with him. And we will bring him up in a few seconds, and they will actually speak more fully about that book and about that very issue. So if you thought Sex and Love was hot, just wait until we get to the authorship debate. Any other questions?
Our local great scholar, the regrettably late Northrop Frye, in A Natural Perspective, his book on Shakespearean comedy, makes the plays concretizations of cosmic forces. You, in your comments today, have not drawn any kind of parallels between everyday, ordinary human experience, the experience of sex, the experience of love, and the cosmos, the way that people like Frye speak of such things. Would you have any comments in that direction?
Well, Frye was a mythic critic, wasn't he? He sees the plays in terms of myth, or what you call the cosmos. There are various approaches to them. My approach in speaking today has been primarily, I suppose, in relation to human psychology and to language. Many approaches to Shakespeare are possible and valid. Northrop Frye was a great critic, but that doesn't mean to say, I think, that everybody has to use his specific approach. I mean, there are cosmic consequences. Othello draws on the whole sense of the cosmos, doesn't he, when he's talking about chaos is come again, for example. So I think that's a perfectly valid approach, but not perhaps one with which I'm particularly concerned myself. Poor Andrea.
Yeah, I'm just curious to ask, what, through all your studies, do you have a favorite couple who are a love couple in Shakespeare, and what would make them your favorite couple?
What is my favorite couple of lovers in Shakespeare? Oh dear. Well, of course, in some ways, the most entertaining relationship is that between Antony and Cleopatra. I mean, that is, in some way, I think of all Shakespeare's plays, Antony and Cleopatra comes very high for richness of language, for extraordinary poetic variety and intensity, and the shifting relationship between Antony and Cleopatra is, to me, a perpetually fascinating one. So I think that would have to be my first answer there.
In this general vicinity while I'm up here.
This goes back to the Northrop Frye question, but not to deal with Frye, to deal with the cosmic just purely in Shakespearean terms. My favorite sonnet is 116, which has a more Platonic conception of love that I think, although love is always carnal in Shakespeare.
So remind us which one that is.
Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Yeah. Love is not love that alters when alteration finds. So there's in some ways the plays in their freedom of interpretation seem to invite a marriage of true minds in enacting that cosmic sense of love, particularly since they're so enduring and their meaning keeps perpetuating and unfolding as we go through time. So I'm wondering if you have any sense of that dimension of love as it goes through the plays. I've just mentioned it in that one sonnet.
I think Shakespeare's mind is restlessly exploratory, and he's constantly looking at different ways of looking at human experience and of recording and reproducing human experience in stage terms. So I don't think he has any single view which you can trace from the beginning of his career to the end of his career. I see, and this is very much something I felt as I was writing my book about sex and love, for which I sort of studied the plays in roughly chronological order, that as he goes through, his view of sex and love changes, shifts, deepens, goes through different phases, goes through the period of the Troilus and Cressida, King Lear period, when there's a large component of sexual nausea, going through to the final plays, where whether or not he knew they were going to be his final plays, and of course he might not have done, but in any case there you get a much more controlled, a more moral point of view, I think. So his view is shifting all the time. I mean, the sonnet you quote, 116, is a very great and very popular sonnet, of course. And he's talking there initially about the marriage of minds, which is something I've been mentioning here, that the mind, and that he does often use this dichotomy between the mind and the body, the soul and the body. So to that extent, there is a degree of continuity, I think.
Anyone? All right.
It's a bit like Puck, isn't it, or Ariel, isn't it?
Two quick questions, you answer whichever you want. One is that Renee Fleming, the soprano, in her memoir, when she was talking about playing Desdemona, she said that she was very puzzled how to make this real to herself, and her director, I can't remember who the name was, had suggested to her that Desdemona had sort of assigned herself, or been by tacit approval between Othello and her, assigned the task of calming Othello's temper or rage whenever it would show, and that this accounts for how long it took Desdemona to realize the situation she was in when he starts accusing her. So I'm interested in any comment you have to make about that.
Well, the first comment is that René Fleming was singing in a different work of art. Verdi's very great opera, which is a masterpiece, absolute masterpiece. Frank Kermode said he thought it was greater than Shakespeare's play. Nevertheless, is a different work of art, and one significant difference is in Desdemona's role, because Verdi and Boito, his librettist, give her an Ave Maria, along with the Willow Song, which surely brings in a specifically Christian and religious dimension at that particular point. And certainly that scene is a point of repose, a point of calm before the storm of the murder, in both the play and in the opera. And I'm sure that is part of Shakespeare's dramaturgy. He is increasing the possibility of tension and of passion in the final scene by calming us, calming Desdemona, calming Emilia down before Othello erupts upon the scene. So yeah, I can quite understand an actress wanting to find that sense before she has to go through the terrible experience of the final scene of being murdered on stage twice, more or less. Yeah, I think I can see that point of view.
I think we've got time for one more before we switch gears, and I saw one up in this corner over here.
I have a very particular question about Measure for Measure, because one of the things that's always puzzled me about the play is I don't really quite understand what Isabella's draw is. I mean, what Angelo and the Duke both see in her, and I was wondering if you had a particular take on her.
What was what Desdemona? What
So the question is, what do the Duke and Angelo really see in Isabella? What's her attraction to them?
Her draw. Oh, I see. Sorry, that was the word I didn't catch. Yeah. Oh, I see. Well, I think it might be one thing to one of them and something different to another. I mean, some people, if you're looking at it from a Freudian point of view, I suppose you might say that from Angelo's point of view, the desire to pollute the apparent purity of Isabella might be a sort of perverted a form of sexual desire. The Duke, on the other hand, I would think is more reasonably thought of as seeing her as somebody who has great qualities of spiritual virtue with which he wants to be allied. I do think, however, that Measure for Measure is not a play in which psychological realism is predominantly present. There is a great deal of dramatic manipulation in Measure for Measure. The play shifts gear very significantly in the second part after the arrangement of the bed trick, and the Duke starts having to rewrite Shakespeare's plot for him. He becomes a sort of playwright within the play. And you get that extraordinarily brilliant final scene, a brilliant piece of dramatic craftsmanship where so many threads are woven together. But I don't see it as one which is totally convincing psychologically, any more than the bed trick is. The bed trick is a form of rape of a man by a woman, it seems to me, both in this play and in All's Well That Ends Well. And so I'm diverging a bit from your question. But I mean, this is part of what I was saying about very early on about defining romantic love. The passion of one person for another may often seem inexplicable or even ridiculous to the onlookers. It's not easy, is it? Do you find?
Thank you. And on that note, we will let Professor Wells have a seat. He's been standing for an awfully long time, so let him relax for a little bit. And as I mentioned, we are very lucky to have with us here also the Reverend Dr. Paul Edmondson. Paul is the head of knowledge and research at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon. He is also director of the Stratford-upon-Avon Poetry Festival, the general editor of Blogging Shakespeare, and many, many other things, in addition to being the co-editor, along with Stanley Wells, of Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, which, as I mentioned, deals a little bit with the authorship controversy. If any of you were here yesterday for Talking Theatre, you already know what a knowledgeable and insightful scholar Paul is, and what a gifted public speaker he is. And we are so happy to have him join us here again today. So come on up.
Thank you, Andrew, for those kind words. Stanley, thank you for your talk. There are many things one might say about the Shakespeare authorship discussion, and we're here primarily because to talk about this book at this point, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Evidence, Argument and Controversy. It was published in April by Cambridge University Press. And we thought we'd talk a little bit about the reasons for that book, and then open the floor to questions, because a question already came up at the end of your talk about the authorship discussion. And I suppose one of the reasons why we wanted to produce the book was from where we see Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon, wasn't it? And the number of times the question about the authorship discussion comes up in any of the 5 Shakespeare houses, which the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust cares for in and around Stratford, and the number of times it might come up after a talk to any group of students of any age. It often comes up.
Yes, it's a very frequent topic.
And in 2010, we heard of a Hollywood film, the title of which escapes me, called Anonymous, directed by the director of Godzilla. in Independence Day, and The Day After Tomorrow, Roland Emmerich, a distinguished German director. And we thought possibly the time was ripe, that Anonymous provided the catalyst for an authorship campaign, which the Birthplace Trust decided to lead. Coupled with that was the fact that at least 2 universities were proselytizing the authorship discussion in courses, including in the UK, the University of Brunel, where you can do an MA in Shakespeare authorship studies. And whereas we have no objection at all to anyone thinking about how Shakespeare wrote, and that being about models of early modern authorship and collaboration and bibliographical inquiry, even to consider the authorship discussion as a cultural phenomenon is a worthy academic enterprise.
And that's what, of course, James Shapiro, who I gather spoke here a couple of years ago, does in his excellent book, Contested Will.
But we felt that these courses were drawing anti-Shakespeareans to write things which were going. And we questioned this as an academic inquiry, because at the heart of this is a treatment of history and how we understand the past. And 3 reasons. The question often comes up, there was a Hollywood film, and there were suddenly academic courses springing up. The other one,
Oregon, sorry, yeah.
Oregon, yeah. Portland, Oregon.
Portland, yeah.
And elsewhere, as far as we know. We decided to make a stand mainly, and some of you may have come across a website we launched called 60 Minutes with Shakespeare, 60minuteswithshakespeare.com, in which we invited 60 people to talk for 60 seconds each on some aspect of the authorship discussion. And those people, Harriet Walter and Anthony Sher and Gregory Doran and Simon Callow.
Stephen Fry went on for 4.5 minutes.
Stephen Fry goes on for 4.5 minutes. Margaret Drabble spoke, and Michael Holroyd, and lots of Shakespeare scholars. John, you can listen to a minute, or you can listen to an hour, or 13 minutes, however long you want to spend there on posts. And that was very, and it's free, and that was important. And also we wrote an ebook online, shakespearebitesback.com.
When we say a book, it's a long essay. It's about 7,000 words, so it's not all that formidable.
And it's free, and it's a polemical essay, as well as the kinds of discussions we've had. And also we held a webinar, again free, which you can find via bloggingshakespeare.com, and it's called Proving Shakespeare, and it's a discussion which was, the occasion for which was the publication of this book, and Ros Barber, who wants to believe that Christopher Marlowe wrote Shakespeare. So that's called Proving Shakespeare, and it's a webinar made freely available via bloggingshakespeare.com. So a lot of this is online, and a lot of anti-Shakespearean material is online, so it seemed like the right... And Stanley, do you want to take...
But we'd like to have something in print. Paul and I put our heads together and thought about how we might look into gobbets of appropriate, like, for example, we wanted to show how it began. We're in the middle of the 19th century with Delia Bacon, and a rather tragic character, interesting tragedy. The opening paragraph.
Yeah, the opening paragraph just sort of opens, setting the ball rolling. Delia Bacon paid a visit to Stratford-upon-Avon, where she lodged initially at 15 College Street, not far from Holy Trinity Church. She met with the vicar, George Granville, who allowed her access outside normal visiting hours to Shakespeare's grave, which she wished to investigate in the hope that it concealed solutions to an imagined code, which would demonstrate that there were reasons to question received ideas about the authorship of Shakespeare's works. If only I had the proper tools, she complained to herself, I could lift the stone myself, weak as I am, with no one to help. A strange weariness came over her. She left her mission.
She was a very interesting woman, and so we have an essay about her. She wrote what's always called an unreadable book, but we did, and Graham Holderness did so, and has a very interesting study of the book, which takes it quite seriously and looks at what motives lay behind her writing.
Delia Bacon also represents in the volume for Andrew Murphy of St Andrews University an interesting figure, because she represents an intelligent woman for that mind to become, as it were, disciplined within a university. A symbol for an amateur scholar against, and that kind of clash, I think, continues between people who are exploring alternative candidatures for Shakespeare's authorship, who are not professional scholars, but are independent writers and thinkers.
Yeah, the three people at the moment as possible authors of Shakespeare are Christopher Marlowe, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who in the Francis Bacon. So we got the world's leading experts, I think we can legitimately say, on those people. Charles Nicholl about Christopher Marlowe, Charles Nicholl, who wrote a wonderful book called The Lodger, Alan Stewart, who is the editor of the works of Francis Bacon, and
Alan
Nelson, who is going to write a chapter about them in relation to the Shakespeare authorship question.
There's also a chapter on the many other people who have been suggested as candidates, alternative nominees for the authorship. It was 77.
77 at the last count. There's probably another one last week.
That chapter's called The Unusual Suspects.
One of the hazards of my profession is that the newspaper calls who will ring up William Shakespeare, or Lady Mary Sidney wrote them, or what do you think of it? And, well, I try to be polite.
The next section in the book is about Shakespeare himself.
Yes.
and assembles challenging ways of thinking, we hope, about the authorship for anyone who wants to doubt Shakespeare's authorship. For example, in the last 30 years, and Stanley, you've been at the forefront of this, in Shakespeare studies, it's become more and more accepted that Shakespeare was a collaborator on some of the plays, certainly at the beginning and at the end of his career. And that rather puts paid, surely, to any theory that it's a single alternative nominee who could have produced the work, an aristocrat writing in a bubble on his own. Any nominee who's proposed on their own just falls by the wayside, don't they? If our understanding of these texts demonstrate that they're co-authored. So
we have an excellent article by John Jowett about collaboration. And Paul's used the word aristocrats, and it's interesting that a very high proportion of those people who are suggested are aristocrats, which I think tells us something about the people who are putting forward the arguments. They somehow feel that the plays ought to have been written by somebody whose social status was equivalent to his, or even possibly her, artistic.
Shakespeare is a man of the theatre as well, which looks at the plays and shows that whoever wrote them knew all about practical theatrical practice, which again makes it unlikely to have been a lonely aristocrat.
The plays are written by somebody who knew, for example, how much time to allow for scene changes, how much characters would have to double, as they did in Shakespeare's time, how the boy actors who played the women's parts would behave, and so on.
That section also includes stylometric evidence about how to discover two hands or more at work within a single text.
Which has been much aided by computerized studies in the last 30 years.
That's
or
from
so.
Macdonald Jackson at Auckland University. And there's a chapter about Shakespeare in Warwickshire in that section, and local names in the plays, and also Shakespeare's schooling.
Yeah, the education is a very important matter, because another of the points that people often raise when they're doubting the authorship is to say, how could a man from Stratford have learnt enough to write the plays? Well, in fact, this question was answered about 70 years ago in a vast and also unreadable book by T.W. Baldwin called Shakespeare's Small Latin and Less Greek, which discusses the educational system in Shakespeare's time. Stratford had a grammar school. We don't know that Shakespeare went to it, because we don't know that anybody went to it, in the sense that there are no records. But Shakespeare lived in Stratford. The school must have had pupils, and it's perfectly clear that the plays demonstrate the sort of education that a grammar school boy of Shakespeare's time would have received. And I may say that is a much better education in certain areas than we give our young people nowadays. A boy, it had to be a boy, going to an Elizabethan grammar school, got a training in rhetoric and oratory and the classics, which would have raised him to the level of a graduate in the classics nowadays.
So Carol Rutter from the University of Warwick in that chapter demonstrates that actually all you need to write the complete works of Shakespeare is a really good grammar school education. You didn't need...
Plus quite a big imagination.
But importantly, you didn't need to have gone to university.
No, quite.
Because quite a lot of the other nominees are all university educated, or if they're not aristocratic, or both.
And I have a chapter there too on allusions to Shakespeare, which I as meticulously as I can go through every allusion that we know about to Shakespeare from his own time. There are many different sorts of allusions, the references to him in poems, the references to him in other people's plays, the documentary evidence, which is considerable. We know quite a lot about Shakespeare. The trouble is we don't know the things we'd most like to know. That's really the problem. Do you want to read the last paragraph of that, Paul?
It's your work, you read it.
Okay, well, I sum up by saying, no one expressed doubt that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon wrote the works attributed to him until the middle of the 19th century. It was a period of intellectual ferment in which many orthodoxies, social, religious, and scientific, were being challenged. Gaps in the record began to make people uneasy. There are certainly gaps in the records of Shakespeare's life, but there's nothing unusual about them. We know more about him than about many of his contemporaries, such as John Lilly, Thomas Kidd, John Webster, or John Ford. While aristocratic families had their muniment rooms in which personal papers were preserved, the lives of most middle and lower class people, even those who achieved fame in their own time, were little memorialized, and then generally through court records of slight personal interest, such as those that tell us about Shakespeare's financial dealings and purchases of property. All this should give the doubters pause, and anyone wishing to question the evidence set out in this chapter needs to disprove all of it, not simply, as is often done, to express skepticism about individual items. The evidence that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare is overwhelming, and to dispute it is to challenge the entire validity of historical research. Shall we open to questions now?
Yeah, well done. The third section of the book.
What?
The third section of the book.
Well, Paul,
Just before we open the floor to questions, the third section of the book looks at the phenomenon's afterlife, as it were, and ongoing cultural life. So there you will find an essay about it in relation to conspiracy theories from Professor Kate McCluskey, University of Birmingham, an essay critiquing the website called the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, which is set up by the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition, and an essay critiquing the film Anonymous, an essay about the treatment of Shakespeare's authorship discussion in works of fiction, my essay about the authorship campaign and how we did it and what its outcomes were, and an afterword by James Shapiro as well for the book. So questions, please.
All right. Oh, goodness. Here we go. All right. We've got a few in. We've got until 6:30 here in this space, so we've got a good few minutes to to get some of these questions out. Go for it.
Oh, okay. I was wondering if you could speak to why there seems to be such a uniquely large humdrum around the authorship of Shakespeare in particular, when we don't get such a to-do surrounding the provenance or authorship of other acknowledged geniuses of art, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Dante, Chaucer, Milton. We don't get this enormous debate. Why is it Shakespeare?
I think because, in part, all of the other people you just mentioned, as famous as they are not as famous or culturally recognizable or transcend national boundaries in the same way that Shakespeare does. And I think, it's interesting to historicize when the discussion started towards the middle of the 19th century and to ask ourselves, well, what else was going on at that time culturally and intellectually? And there we will find things like Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. So as the genesis, the evolution of the world is being discussed and represented, so the works of the greatest writer and his points of origin are also being discussed. It's also the period of time when we perceive something like the rise of detective fiction, in which the reader is presented with clues and pieces, as it were, like a jigsaw puzzle, and then invited to repattern them in the most likely or unlikely of ways, which then has an effect on historical discourse and how we look at the past. So all of these things and more sort of pave the way for this kind of discussion to start. And actually, in the other direction from why aren't other great artists subjected to this kind of treatment, in the other direction lies all the many other things that are subjected to this kind of treatment, all of which look to us like conspiracy theories, and for which often the Shakespeare authorship discussion hangs in the background as a sort of useful context.
There are one or two other parallels, apparently. I asked a Russian, and they said, yes, somebody questions the authorship of no, not Tolstoy, a novel written only about 60 years ago, Softly Flows the Don. Somebody else mentioned something else recently. But it is interesting, why Shakespeare only? Because even at the time, that all the things that Paul is talking about there were other people similarly who might have become the victims. But of course, we also know very much, don't we, of the other examples of conspiracy theory. The Holocaust theory, for example, all sorts of things do happen.
Anyone else? Okay, here we go.
Hi, I was wondering if you think that the entire debate about authorship has the potential to marginalize quite a lot of the important work being done on collaboration, and that both sides, there's a danger of them putting that to the side. And I'd refer specifically to people like Brian Vickers' quite personal attack on Laurie Maguire and Emma Smith's work on Middleton and things like that, and that actually it can entrench both sides in a desire to look away from potentials of collaboration.
Sorry, I'm not clear how the authorship discussion would sort of relate to the example that you've just given of other kinds of collaboration.
I think in that it potentially entrenches specific individuals' views on wanting to either disprove Shakespeare's authorship or to firmly confirm the authorship, and that actually, not that it has a destabilizing effect on that other work.
I don't think it has any serious effect on what I would regard as serious scholarly work, in contradistinction to what I regard as unserious scholarly work, those who deny the authorship. I don't think it impinges at all effectively on the work of people like Mac Jackson or Brian Vickers or Gary Taylor or John Jowett on the collaborative aspects of authorship. Happily, I think there is still a very distinct division between the two camps.
I think what's interesting, though, is that our work has perhaps oxygenated the discussion differently in terms of engaging with scholars to write for the volume. So the fact that we have leading experts on collaboration authorship studies like John Jowett, University of Birmingham, and Mac Jackson is a really kind of new way of thinking about this discussion, because for years the Academy has ignored it, and finally we've actually, and Jim Shapiro as well, have encouraged the Academy, are encouraging the Academy not to ignore it, that actually there's something quite significant and serious going on in this discussion, and it's too often the case that Shakespeare scholars have put their heads in the sand about this, hoping it will go away. It won't. So
no, it won't, and that's illustrated by the fact that a few weeks ago, a book which parodies our book appeared, a book called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, ?
Do you know, it's co-edited by the grandson of Evelyn Waugh. And my first reaction was like, how would he like it if I called a book Brideshead Revisited? Or Scoop?
It's rather a slung together sort of book, sort of anthology, quite a lot of it already available online. And a few weeks ago, there's a journal in England called the Literary Review, which is well, what it sounds like, which reviews books. And the editor rang me up and said, "Oh, we've just got in for review. A copy of Shakespeare Beyond Doubt ? We're running a review by the author of that, by Alexander Waugh, of our book, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. Would you like to review Shakespeare Beyond Doubt ? So I have, and it's my review. Both reviews are in the current issue of the Literary Review.
But the Shakespeare Beyond Doubt ? Is not a riposte to our book. As Stanley said,
No,
it's just
it's not,
slung together by Vanity Press,
Yeah.
hoping for as much attention as possible.
All of the scholarship that we're presented with is all done in English, sort of by English scholars. What does the rest of the world feel about?
There are quite a lot of doubters in other countries. A book has recently appeared by an Italian, suggested John Florio wrote Shakespeare. There are several Russian books about suggesting the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare. There's been a French anti-Shakespearean movement too.
And we work in Sweden as well, don't we?
Oh, in Norway,
yeah.
There was an extraordinary thing. It happened in Norway. They came to see me about it, and they were making a television program about some chap, a church organist in Norway, and they came to see me to film me in my study in Stratford. Responding to this, to his idea that, that not only that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, but that there are a lot of Shakespeare manuscripts, he believes, all buried beneath stones on an island off the coast of Newfoundland. How the hell they got there, I don't know. But, and I was thinking about this when the television crew brought into my study the man who was propounding this theory, and I had to discuss it with him. And they've made, I believe, 4 television programs about it.
So I mean, there are many examples like that, and I suppose one of the most interesting things then to do is to say, well, why do people continue to tell these stories? Where do these narratives come from? What's driving that? Is it some kind of longing for a better biography of Shakespeare that we just don't have? There are these gaps in the record, which there's a great essay in here by Andrew Hadfield, which is called Theorizing Shakespeare's Authorship, in which he writes about, you know, these gaps and how they're not unusual in the lives of early modern people.
Well, I'm afraid we have come to the end of our time here, and I can't think of another Friday night that's more stimulating than talking about sex and love and authorship and all of these things. We are incredibly indebted to our guests from the other Stratford for coming to spend their time with us here. They have been here for nearly a week and have taken in a lot of shows, have contributed their thoughts, their insights with us, enlightened us, given us a lot of things to think about today and a lot of things to go out of here thinking about. So thank you so much, Stanley and Paul, for being here with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well done, Stanley.
We'll go back.
So they're just going to pop round back and divest themselves of their mics, and then they will shortly be out in the lobby to sign books if you have anything you wish to get signed.